we might as well get started. Thank you all for coming. My name is Kristen Watson. I'm the human rights investigator for the city of Iowa City, and I'm very happy to introduce our panelists today. Dr. Jeannette Gabriel is the director of the Schwalb Center for Israel and Jewish Studies at the University of Nebraska-Omaha. And so we're very happy to have her here to talk about Panache before the Shoah, the effect of Jewish 1930s refugees on Iowa City's progressivism. So take it away, Dr. Gabriel.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Thank you for the invitation. It's such an important moment in the history of the United States to be celebrating Jewish American Heritage Month. We really have unprecedented levels of anti-Semitism in the United States. And it seemed like such an important moment to look at another period in time where there was extreme anti-Semitism in the United States, which is the period leading up to World War II. And this is a continuation of work that I've been doing for quite some time, coming out of the time that I spent at the Iowa Women's Archives at the University of Iowa Library, working on an archival collection focusing around the history of Jewish women in Iowa. And so I have considered previously in public events, lectures that you can see online, what the experience was, what the communities in Iowa thought about post-World War II refugees. And today I want to focus in a little bit more tightly on the Austrian and German refugees who came before the end of the war and consider the impact that that has had on Iowa City as a whole. It struck me when I was a PhD student in Iowa City coming from the East Coast, in many ways how European Iowa City is. And I always sort of wanted to explore some of the roots of that. And I certainly can't make an argument that it was German and Viennese immigrants who have created the intellectual and progressive vigor entirely of Iowa City. But I'm going to try to make an argument that they certainly have contributed to it. So let me give you a little bit of background. Between the summer of 1938 and 1940, there were 75,000 Austrian and German refugees who settled in the United States. And this was after Kristallnacht. It was a moment of openness in fairly restrictive US immigration policy, which allowed for a small number of highly educated immigrants to enter the country. Most of those immigrants joined the growing refugee community based in Washington Heights, which is a beautiful neighborhood in northern New York City that has a lovely view out over the cliffs of the Hudson River. By the time the 1940 census was conducted, there were 20,000 refugees congregated in Washington Heights, with 2 German language newspapers, 8 kosher butcher shops, synagogues, restaurants, social and athletic clubs, and cafes, as well as Lublow's Palm Garden, which offered German cabaret. And all that is taken from Stephen Lowenstein's work, Frankfurt on the Hudson. So the urban-based, highly educated refugees that came in this pre-war wave were very different from the post-war refugees that would trickle into the countries after the borders finally reopened in 1950-51. And the conditions of wartime America were also different. The enclave in Washington Heights was strongly patriotic. And they were very concerned about internal political discussions about the situation unfolding in Europe, and that played out in the pages of German language newspapers and in the neighborhood parks. Now, the focus of my presentation is not talking about Washington Heights, but actually talking about what I call the Jewish hinterlands, or when Jewish people are living out in areas of the country that are not part of these East Coast enclaves. And I'm going to focus on of course, Iowa and Iowa City, the region around Iowa City. Now, this was actually a very special area for Viennese and German refugees for a series of reasons. One was the Quakers set up a hostel called Scattergood in Scattergood School. And this was a model that they hoped to replicate as a refugee hostel in 16 other communities throughout the world. However, they ran into significant issues at Scattergood, and it wound up being the only refugee hostel that they operated in these pre-war years. But the having the Scattergood hostel so close to Iowa City, located in West Branch, created a lot of momentum in terms of cross-cultivation of the refugees who were at Scattergood coming into Iowa City, and in particular to the University of Iowa, but interacting with the community in Iowa City as a whole, and not just Iowa City, but also Cedar Rapids and West Branch. So that is one dynamic that's particularly different about Iowa City. The second, and this is a similarity that Iowa City had with other university towns across the United States, is that it was a place that German and Austrian scholars who were refugees came to work. And this, one can argue, has had the most significant long-term impact on the refugee influence in Iowa City. And the third is actually a single individual. And it's not often, I'm a social historian, it's not often that I would say a single individual has such a tremendous impact. But Dr. Arthur Stendler was really a forerunner in thinking about how to continue the bringing over large networks of refugees. This was a policy that the Jewish community had invoked in signing many affidavits to bring over family members during the pogroms when the US borders closed in 1921. Stendler decides to continue that policy and very dramatically brings over 12 of his family members to Iowa City. And because they are all coming from a highly educated particular group within Germany, it has a significant impact on the region. And I'll talk a little bit more about Stendler as we move along. But I want to begin with Scattergood. There are many, many different histories of Scattergood, but I'm going to take a different tact. And I want to say, before I get into the focus around Scattergood, that work that has been done on the group of immigrants in Washington Heights tends to focus in three main areas. The attitudes that the refugees had to their homeland. Annie Schinderlin's work really focuses on the influence that refugees had in Germany in the post-war era. The role of artists and intellectuals in influencing American culture and higher education. Of course, there's Anthony Helbut's groundbreaking work, Exiled in Paradise, German refugee artists and intellectuals in America from the 1930s to the present, and even Erhard Bahr's close examination of the refugee community in Los Angeles. And finally, there's been some important scholarship that has documented the efforts of the American Emergency Committee in the aid of displaced foreign scholars. And that organization played a significant role in bringing refugees to the University of Iowa. This project, as I said, is really much more focused on the Jewish experience in the hinterlands and taking a look at what the impact of the German and Austrian refugees is on the Midwest communities and also the small Jewish communities that existed within these Midwest areas. So I want to begin not by revisiting the histories that have been done of Scattergood, and there are several really excellent histories, but rather instead taking a look at some of the power behind the scenes that allowed Scattergood to happen. The American Friends Services Committee, which was a Quaker organization, organized Scattergood nationally, but it could not have taken place. The hostel could not have been set up and flourished without local support from within Iowa. So let me see if I can just pull up my presentation there and we can take a look at some of this. Whoops, that didn't do it, did it? Okay, sorry about that. Let me try again here. Oh, I see. All right. One more time. You'd think after years of Zoom, I would be better at this. Okay. So I want to start by looking at where some of that local support from Scattergood comes from. As I was doing research on Scattergood, I was very surprised to keep coming across this gentleman's name, James J. Newland, who was the vice president of Pioneer Hybrid Corn Company in Des Moines. And J.J. Newland was a Quaker. He was on the board of the Scattergood Hostel, and he had a tremendous impact on bringing about the hostel and supporting it, building up financial and political support from throughout the state. Newland, whose work with the Pioneer corn hybrid industry has been very well documented, at least in the Des Moines region, but not really looking at its national significance. His perspective was about creating hybrid corn so that a much greater population could be fed throughout the world. And by the beginning of World War II, about 90% of all the corn that's being developed is for hybrid. And the impact that Newland has in creating opportunities for the people coming out of Scattergood is really tremendous because he is connected within Iowa. So it's not just this outside Quaker American Friends Service Committee project, but an inside Iowa project. And I want to specifically mention his son, Owen Newland, who as a young man, immediately at the end of the war, goes to Europe to work with refugees and really continues his family's Quaker commitment to supporting refugees, not just in Europe, but also in the United States. And so this very tight connection between Pioneer Hybrid Corn Company and the Scattergood Hostel is something that really deserves more consideration. Scattergood tends to be looked at as a national project that is about integrating the German and Austrian immigrants into sort of the Iowa Midwest and providing them opportunities. One of the reasons that it's considered to fail is because it is sort of outsiders. But the Newland narrative challenges that and suggests there's a very interesting and rich, where's my notes? Interesting and rich history within Iowa that really needs to be looked at a little bit further. For example, Newland works with the editor at the Des Moines Register, Waymack, W.W. Waymack, and sets up that the Des Moines Register will be producing a series of editorials in support of Scattergood. And I want to also mention that Newland is really, really instrumental in William Penn College in Oskaloosa, Iowa, which was a Quaker college founded in 1873, which sort of collapses after the Great Depression and has a moment of revitalization under President Cecil Hinshaw, which Newland brings in, who focuses on three main areas: draft resistance, social equality, and racial integration. And now this gets us to a very interesting point that keep in mind, the German and Austrian refugees are eager to integrate, and they are also very concerned about what is happening in Europe. They don't necessarily agree with the Quaker position on draft resistance. And there's also a tension at play within Scattergood about whether or not the largely Jewish refugees could be viewed as openly Jewish. And many of the refugees who are, I'm just not getting this right today, many of the refugees who are at Scattergood comment on how uncomfortable they feel practicing Jewish holidays, not that they feel the Quakers are in any way pressuring them to become Quaker, but that they feel they need to, in some ways, hold back from being openly Jewish in order to be seen as open to assimilation and making connections with the local community. So this big press article in the Iowa City newspaper is a perfect example of this tension. Refugees at Scattergood prepare for Christmas. Well, the reality is that the vast majority of the refugees, of course, are not actually celebrating Christmas, but this is not something that is recognized by Scattergood or necessarily seen as the message that they want to take out into the broader community at large. So this tension, as it develops, creates impact that while there are a lot of refugees at Scattergood, their main focus over time really becomes trying to get out as quickly as possible and trying to find jobs. And I want to highlight there, this is a draft card in World War II from one of the residents, Lewis Hack, and he is listing his residency at Scattergood. And you can see he's from Panache in Bavaria, and he's listing himself as unemployed. So the average stay at Scattergood is a little less than 4 months, and families that are coming there, or more often single men, are really looking for opportunities to move along. So now I want to mention the role that Pioneer Hybrid really plays in placing people in jobs. This is Carl Schnabel from Vienna, and Carl was at Scattergood. His son was in Kindertransport out of Vienna and was in England, where he mentored under an Episcopalian reverend. And the family was reunited in Omaha after the war. Carl is able to get jobs in seed companies that are connected to Newland's network. So Newland really sets up a network for jobs where he's asking his colleagues throughout the seed industry to take a chance in hiring immigrants and to bring them on. And we see this in a variety of ways. For example, ML Deutsch, who's a very close friend of Carl Schnabel, in Germany was an executive in a brewery and had a law degree. When he leaves Scattergood, he's able, in November of 1939, he's able to get a clerical job at the Des Moines office of Pioneer Hybrid Corn Company, and later on become the accountant and bookkeeper there. So it's this type of network for jobs that is providing opportunities. Other immigrants, refugees in Scattergood are sort of desperately trying to find jobs locally, and this creates a relationship between the local community and the refugees. For example, Jacob and Melanie Winkler were offered a shared management position at the University of Iowa's Hillel House, and later on moved to Chicago, where Jacob worked as a draftsman. Rudy Schreck, who was one of the residents at Scattergood, got a night clerk job at a very small hotel in Corning, Iowa, before he was able to get a job selling Fuller brushes in Iowa City. And a student, several students, both Peter Schick and another veterinarian student, Peter Lugas, both worked on Iowa farms before they went to college. So there is an attempt to sort of move out into the countryside, in a sense, and find jobs in the local community. And in some cases, people stay. In many other cases, they move on. because it is challenging to stay in small towns for this particular group of German and Austrian refugees who are used to a much more urban culture. So that brings me to the story of some of the scholars who are coming into Scattergood, and then through Scattergood getting opportunities to study throughout Iowa, in particular at the University of Iowa, and then also getting academic jobs. So I want to just mention a couple of them. The first that I want to talk about is a complicated figure. His name is Ernest van de Haas, and he is a radical activist in Italy, where he grows up, a dissident under Mussolini. And he is jailed under Mussolini for a period of 3 years, where he spends most of his time in solitary confinement, and then is able somehow to reunite with a brother in the United States and make his way to New York and then out to Scattergood. So while he is at Scattergood, he finds an opportunity to go to the University of Iowa, and really quite a fascinating story. He is studying as a master's student in economics, and he's working in the kitchen while he's at the University of Iowa in 1941 and 42. Some faculty members are supporting him by paying his tuition. Right upon finishing his degree, he meets up with Sidney Hook, who's a staunch right-wing conservative, and becomes a leading right-wing conservative economist, even to the point of becoming close to Kissinger. So I'm just really struggling with my PowerPoint here today. Okay, so this is a picture of him, and it's really quite a famous situation that someone would flip so far from the left to the right. I wouldn't say in any means that that Iowa necessarily played a role in that, but he reflects back on this situation in Scattergood and comments that people are really struggling, trying to blend in to Americanization, but not really wanting to, because they come from an elite situation in Vienna and throughout Germany that has really disappeared. For example, at Scattergood, there's emphasis on men and women both doing chores, which is not part of the Viennese culture, and also that everyone there is expected to do farm work, which doesn't fit in well with the idea of urban intellectuals. But there is also sort of a very vibrant group of people who are coming in to Scattergood, who begin to look for opportunities, and the University of Iowa actually offers them. This is Frank Schloss. He was a ski champion in Vienna, and here he is able to set up a class within the women's athletic department in the spring of 1941, where he's teaching girls how to ski. And this is such a cool little piece showing the sort of different jumping steps that he's doing. So the contributions, the university is actually quite open, because it's mentioned in several places that the curriculum is really not flexible. It's not like people are developing new classes at this time. And yet having all of these refugees come provides an opportunity that the community can't just ignore. I want to mention Donald Hopf. His father was a mathematics professor in Germany who lost his job being Jewish and finally was able to get another position at Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. Donald is able to come to the United States as a young man, and he gets a scholarship at Drake College in Des Moines. And he gives an interview where he basically says Hitler doesn't seem that bad. He's very naive. But what's fascinating about Donald and his sort of he's doing a lot of wild student things in Des Moines. There's a car accident that he and a bunch of young men are driving wildly. And he also is, as you can see here, putting ads in the local newspapers looking for work. And this is really interesting because this is not sort of an Iowa model. This is what the Viennese and German community back in Washington Heights are doing to try to make connections with each other. And so he's sort of employing that same tactic in the local Des Moines newspaper. So then I really want to mention some of the quality scholars that come to Scattergood that are embraced by the University of Iowa. And in particular here is Fred Herzog, who was a lifetime judge at the age of 33 in Vienna, who had his lifetime appointment stripped and fled the country. And he is now, once he gets to Scattergood and Iowa City, he is entering the Iowa College of Law as a freshman in order to get recertification. And while that sounds very, very hard, he's actually one of the lucky ones because the certification is only really available for the younger scholars who are coming into the United States. You have some very experienced lawyers and doctors over the age of 50 who cannot participate in a recertification process. So Dr. Herzog is able to quickly slide through the College of Law and begin his career anew in the United States. And these are really opportunities that the University of Iowa is extending to the refugees in an attempt to help them with their integration process. And I want to mention that one of the interesting things that's happening at Scattergood is there are many community lectures. And I want to give you just an example of a couple of those, that these highly trained academics and scholars are going out into the surrounding communities and giving lectures. Here we have a party hosted by Dr. and Mrs. Arthur Stendler to try to integrate the 12 refugees that he has brought over, including his cousin, Julius Glayston. But you will see that they're doing it within the context of Americanization. They're going to sing Christmas carols, right? And then also here we have a student club at the YWCA, William Feist, who's a German refugee, and goes to work as a John Deere engineer in the Quad Cities, is giving a lecture on Who is My Neighbor, again, at a Christmas play. So while the local community is interested in hearing from the refugees, in a sense, it is very much on the community's terms, not necessarily wanting to integrate them as Jewish, but to take some benefits from their experiences as scholars and artists. So there are a series of other scholars who come to the University of Iowa and make a tremendous impact, including Dr. Arthur Stendler. They come at different periods of time, some of them a little earlier than the 38 post-Kristallnacht, and some of them after the war. But the impact they have is really tremendous on the city in terms of creating a powerful tradition at the University of Iowa of top scholars who are engaged in the highest levels of their fields. So here we have Kurt Lewin. Kurt Lewin is an economist. He trains as an economist and he finishes his degree in economics at the University of Iowa, even though he has significant training back in Vienna. But again, he needs that recertification. And he becomes a founding member of the University of Iowa's geography department. Now, Lewin is creates a very important development in human geography in that he is arguing for agency and where am I here? He's arguing for agency and in many ways is seen as one of the foremost agency of humans, that geography is not just a scientific study, but it's a scientific study of human behavior. And many people view Lewin as sort of the formative voice in the development of the field of human geography. So initially, it seems like he's going to make a tremendous impact on Iowa City, but he stays from 1935 to 1944, and then he moves to MIT, where he establishes the Research Center for Group Dynamics. So sometimes it's not like a long-lasting tradition, but it is enough to really have an impact on the field. And so then I want to mention George Lockman Moss. George Moss is one of the most sort of interesting scholars. He comes as a history professor to the University of Iowa between 1948 and 1955. He is involved with the Quakers, but he does not come through scattergood. He went to college at a Quaker school in England, and he joins the Army. He gets to the United States. He joins the Army as part of an Army specialized training program at the State University of Iowa, where he recruited for soldiers who were scheduled to take part in post-war US occupation in Europe. About a year later, he becomes a member of the history department of faculty, and really just as the veterans from World War II are coming into the university, he becomes a very important figure within the history department, developing the curriculum, and a popular teacher and in demand all throughout the Midwest. So he finally, in 1955, leaves to go to the University of Wisconsin, where he builds one of the most significant European history programs in the country there. In addition to these scholars, probably the scholar that people know the most about is going to be Gustav Bergman. A lot of people in Iowa City will probably know that name. Bergman was born in Vienna. He earned his PhD in mathematics at the University of Vienna in 1928. He got his PhD. He also studied with Albert Einstein in Berlin. And he finally had to flee in 1938, and he came to the University of Iowa, where he became a professor of both philosophy and psychology. So his work with Einstein in the early 30s in Berlin really established his stature as a scholar. During the early 30s, he was a member of the Vienna Circle, which was a collaboration of scientists, philosophers, mathematicians, who all supported logical positivism, which is, of course, the theory that empirical observation is necessary to verify any sorts of statements of value. So Bergman and Kurt Lewin, who comes to the University of Iowa in psychology, create a powerful force of top scholars in the country who are located at the University of Iowa. Now, I want to mention that it's very important for Bergman that he has the support of the Emergency Committee of Academic Displaced Scholars. And not just that, he also has the support of the University of Iowa president, Eugene Gilmore, who's really instrumental in creating these opportunities for the refugee scholars to come to the university and recertify their degrees, and also to build departments and have some space to grow. In 1972, Bergman is among 5 University of Iowa faculty members who's named to the first Carver professorships that are established as a $3.5 million gift to the university from Roy J. Carver. So his impact is really quite profound. And in addition to all of these folks, now I want to shift to the Stendler narrative. It's really quite impossible to underestimate Stendler's impact and the impact of his family members that he brought to the University of Iowa. So Stendler is, in fact, some people will argue that he structured his entire program at the university, which is really about providing childhood medical care around structures related to labs in Vienna. So Stendler decides to bring over these 12 family members, and this is actually a pretty controversial move in the sense that many people would see this as misusing the affidavit process in order to funnel in many different family members. But the people that he brings over have a tremendous impact on Iowa. For example, he brings lots of nieces and nephews and cousins, and they all attend the University of Iowa and graduate with various degrees, go on to graduate studies, and have a significant impact in particularly in Des Moines, where many of them moved to Des Moines. So let me see if I can just go back to my PowerPoint to show you some of those pictures. Okay, so I've just been tooling along here. Here's George Moss in front of his home in Iowa City in 1936. One of the reasons Moss was so controversial is that he was openly gay in a very early period of time, and received a lot of backlash for that, both within the Jewish community and without. This is documents that are found at the University of Iowa archives. It shows Bergman's travel documents, and then him also here at the University of Iowa. And here is Arthur Stendler. I want to mention his mother, who he brings with him, Olga. Olga attends classes at the University of Iowa in her early 70s. Her entire family is part of this powerful musical and scholarly circle around Albert Einstein in Vienna in the early 30s. So Stendler's cousin, Julius Glaiston, is a baritone. He's considered sort of a child prodigy from the age of 11. He also studies law. So this is showing sort of the intersections in the Viennese world between medicine, music, science, and the arts. And here we have a picture of Stendler opening up his home to all of these different cousins and nieces and nephews. They're living with him, and then they're moving on to Des Moines. One of my favorite narratives of his nieces, of his nephews, Fred and Michael Matthews, they are horsemen and very active in the riding community, in stables, in bringing in famous Viennese horses, and playing a very active role in the Raccoon Valley Pony Club in Des Moines. So that's a really powerful sort of network throughout the area of creative people who are doing fascinating things all throughout the region. So while there's a lot going on in Iowa City, it also is spreading beyond Iowa City through Stendler's connections into Des Moines. I'm just really in my presentation mentioning a small number of narratives. There's many more to tell. In closing, so that we have a little bit of time for Q&A, I want to talk a little bit about what I think is the impact of these individuals and how they really affected the progressive aspects of Iowa City. And I would be happy to share with people much more information on many of these individuals and the role that they played. But in the interest of a short presentation, I'm just really giving you an overview. So in thinking about what the impact is of these individuals, there are Julius Glaiston and his wife are collectors of medieval art, 15th and 16th century medieval art. They show their art at the University of Iowa Art Museum, and they're bringing in academics and artists from all over the world to come into both Des Moines and to Iowa City all the time, so that in a sense, Iowa City sort of becomes a hub around visiting scholars and lectures and activities. I think that's one of the first and foremost interesting and significant impacts. But before I speak too positively, I want to mention some of the negative, is that there was a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism in Iowa City. And that doesn't make it really any different from the rest of the country. There's anti-Semitic incidents happening throughout the country. In 1937, Rabbi Lubchansky, who is the rabbi at Agudas Achim Synagogue, is attacked on the street by a group of youngsters. He reports them to the police, and this is sort of denigrated in the local news as overreaction. There's another big incident 10 years later after the war, where a Hebrew scholar in Iowa City, who will later become the rabbi at Agudas Achim, is attacked and badly beaten on the streets of Iowa City. The Iowa City Attorney General's office does an investigation and finds, contrary to interview statements that are made right after the attack, that this is not related to anti-Semitism in any way. Interesting that and not surprising, that the Jewish community does not want to press charges, does not want to bring attention to these matters. So let me say a couple of things here. One of the things that Stendler does that has a tremendous impact on the future of Iowa City, and in fact, the future of orthopedic care, it's the orthopedic clinic that he sets up primarily for children at the University of Iowa Hospital, is that he offers a position to Ruth Jackson. And Ruth Jackson is graduated from medical school and unable to find a position in the post-war period. She contacts Arthur Stendler, and he is thrilled to give her a position in orthopedic surgery at the University of Iowa, and she becomes recognized as the first woman orthopedic surgeon in the US. And to exist to this day, the Ruth Jackson Orthopedic Society, which is dedicated to the advancement of women in orthopedics, is named in her honor. I would also suggest that there's connections with the Bergman family that create tremendous impact across time. And I want to mention in particular Bergman's daughter, who only recently passed away, Hannah Bergman, and the longstanding impact that she had on the progressive community in Iowa City. This is not to overstate the existence of many others, but Hannah Weston lived in Iowa City for most of her adult life, and she came to New York in 1939, and when Gustav Bergman was hired at the University of Iowa, he brought her to Iowa City in 1944, where he and his second wife, Lola Bergman, who was a historian and a printmaker, brought her up. So Hannah Bergman Weston is well known for her activism in the Democratic Party. At the age of 46, she completed law school at the University of Iowa and ran a private law firm. Probably many of the people watching this program today know about her and could tell me more. She was very, very active in the ACLU and supported the organization's decision to defend the Nazis' right to march at Skokie, and was very active throughout the community as a volunteer in a variety of causes that would be seen as still today somewhat controversial, providing clean needles to drug users and working with homeless organizations. So it's this type of legacy that is, again, this is just a snapshot of a few individuals. It doesn't necessarily create a broader pattern, but the legacy of the individuals who remained is powerful, and the legacy that the scholars built here at the University of Iowa in Iowa City, really bringing the reputation of the university to a national and international level, has great resonance across time. So I think I will stop there, and I can see there's already a few questions pending. I look forward to all of you sort of feel free to just jump in. Would you like me to sort of start answering your questions that you put in the chat? I can just go through those if you'd like.
Yeah, if you'd like to do that, or I can read them either
Oh,
way.
sure, that's fine. It would be best if you read them probably.
Sure. We have one attendee says, why doesn't Iowa City have a bigger Jewish population? I would think we would have more because of the refugees.
So that's a really interesting question. The longstanding Jewish community in Iowa City is based around small business owners, starting in really there was a very, very small early German Jewish community. But then the influx of Russian Jews around the turn of the century were small business owners. And that varies, that's really different from the refugee population that we're seeing, which is coming out of urban-based, highly educated sort of academics. The nature of academics is they tend to move from institution to institution throughout their career. It's more unusual that they stay. And perhaps it's sort of the town and gown tension that you can see sort of running through my presentation, in a sense, that the local Jewish community that sustains across time is in the town with the local businesses, as compared to the academic Jewish community that comes and goes across the decades.
So our second question is, how does these stories compare to other Midwestern states? For example, did U of Wisconsin have influx of Jewish urban, well-educated individuals?
They did. Yes, they did. They had the same type of impact of Austrian immigrants, but because they did not have a hostel like Scattergood, the type of immigrant experience to the university was more one-dimensional. I think there was greater creativity at the University of Iowa in trying to create opportunities, both through integrating students as undergraduates from Scattergood, as graduate students, and also recertification of their degrees that took place during the period before the war that we don't see at Madison because that hostel wasn't there. Also, Wisconsin is a little bit different. I say this because it was my alma mater, and I came out of a small town in Wisconsin and went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Is that much of the Jewish influx into Madison really happens during the 1960s anti-war movement, rather than the earlier period? Those are both great questions. There is something that is different about Iowa, not just because of Arthur Stendler's sort of crusading activism. And again, you can see how careful he had to be because people would argue that he was sort of abusing the affidavit system, which legally he was not, but it could have been viewed that way from an anti-immigrant perspective. But it's not just Stendler, it's really the dynamic with Scattergood and having all these sort of young people. Now you will notice, and I want to comment on this, that my presentation is almost entirely about men. And this really bothered me tremendously. And as I dug into the work a little bit more, it's not that there weren't professional women. Certainly at Scattergood, there were some of the top political leaders in Germany, like that were located at Scattergood. But these very professional women who came to Scattergood, political activists and professional social workers and academics, did not choose to stay or seek out opportunities in Iowa City. And some scholars who are talking about the problems of integration of women refugees talk about the double challenge that women refugees have, bringing family members, and that in some cases, they're just seeking to go back to Germany as soon as possible after the war. So that's answering a question I sort of anticipated would rise, because I certainly was asking it.
We don't have any more written questions. If people want to raise their hands, you as a co-host can allow them to talk, or I can allow them to talk.
Sure. I'm happy to take questions.
Or people can type their questions into the Q&A or the chat box too.
I will say it's very interesting how the idea of Scattergood was to provide economic opportunities for the Viennese refugees. Many Viennese refugees who were in Washington Heights with higher academic degrees were never able to work as professionals again and didn't have the recertification opportunities. So in that sense, the Quaker experiment really provided a tremendous opportunity for many of these Jewish immigrants that they could not have had in Washington Heights. On the other hand, Washington Heights was a really vibrant, intellectual community. And this is always the cost of sort of moving out into the rural spaces. The question about why isn't there a larger Jewish community in Iowa? I think as a Jewish person who lived in Iowa for a while, and I'm sure many others would say how challenging it really is to live in a small town as a Jewish person that isn't unfriendly, but also perhaps isn't openly friendly or embracing. Many of the Jewish people who lived in Iowa in the small towns throughout the state found it really challenging to provide their children with religious education, and often would move to larger urban areas in order to make that possible.
Any other questions for Dr. Gabriel?
Looks like we've got one in the, yeah.
Yes. Someone says, I am interested in George Moss, who was openly gay. How did you discover this? Often in history, those things are not recorded.
Right. Moss is a really fascinating individual, very unusual. Of course, and what's fascinating about Moss, of course, there's a vibrant gay scene in Vienna before the war. So it wouldn't have been that unusual for Jewish intellectuals to be gay in Vienna. But once you become a refugee and you're now sort of dependent on the international Jewish community for charity and the Quaker community, there's a sort of heteronormative pressure, and he does get married and then divorced. So he's not without some tension, but he is really quite a crusading sort of figure. I hate to say before his time, because there were so many other people who were Jewish gay academics at his time. It's just that he really didn't try to hide it at all. It's something that really struck me, is that it's not being used in any way against him throughout his career. In fact, what we see more being used against the Jewish academics is any sort of leftist ties that they might be construed as communists, especially as we move into the McCarthy years after the war. It's a really great question. If you want to reach out to me by email, I would be happy to point you in the direction of some of the scholarship that's been done on this. And it's just mentioned in passing, like it's not a big thing, which I certainly think it was.
And we have a couple of comments which are resonating with me because I have had similar experiences. One attendee says, my mom was so proud that her church invited some Jewish people to a potluck Seder. They served pork.
Yes, welcome to Iowa, right? I can't
Mhm.
tell you how often this happens. And I want to comment on the matzah at Hy-Vee. I'll tell you, living in Omaha, we have the exact same problem. We only had one store carrying Passover products this year. It's really amazing how we live in a culture of much greater diversity, and but yet how much more challenging it is to find Jewish products. And part of that is perhaps the dwindling populations, though the dwindling populations in Iowa City, and it's remained fairly stable, but it's such a low amount. The pork tension is a really huge one, right? And it's not just for the Jewish community. This is a problem for the Muslim community too. It's so deeply integrated into the culture of Iowa, right? And the hog farming, and there's very little sense of really who the Jewish people are. As the director of the Schwalb Center for Israel and Jewish Studies at UNO, I often have students tell me that I'm the first Jewish person they've ever met. And behind closed doors will ask me lots of embarrassing questions, which is why I'm there, right? It's a good experience for them to be able to ask. But most people's experience is that they really haven't had a lot of contact with Jewish people. And in order to integrate, the Jewish community went out of their way to, in small towns like Iowa City, to not really be noisy about being Jewish in order to integrate well into the community. And perhaps that's a dynamic that still exists, right? So, nobody from the Jewish community would have said anything to the church about serving pork because they wouldn't want to make them feel bad.
Someone comments, the New Pioneer store supports by offering Passover foods.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. That's great to hear. I'm still a shareholder. I'm not surprised to hear that at all. And it's nice to know that there is a place that you can still get Passover products. But it's a question of sort of how do people see the Jewish community? I think that's really the question is, do they understand the practices and rituals of the Jewish community, or is it something that's seen as sort of hidden and other? And I think especially in an atmosphere of rising anti-Semitism, I want to say again how much I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all, because it really is a moment where many stereotypes about Jewish wealth and Jewish greed and the Jewish community acting as sort of a cabal are really resurfacing in our society. And any opportunity that we can have to speak out against those stereotypes is valuable.
We have time for one more question if anyone has one before we sign off.
Or comment, doesn't have to be a question.
Yes. Well, it's a thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed speaking to you all today. And like I said, please feel free. You can follow up by email. I'd be happy to answer any questions or share some of the follow-up research. If you have friends that want to see the presentation, I think it will be available online. So this is really, the stories I'm telling you are stories that are largely unheard and unknown, and yet have an impact on what Iowa City is as a community.
So thank you very much. Wonderful. And yes, it will be available on City Channel 4. Give us a couple of days for the cable staff to prepare it. But other than that, it will be up on our website. So thank you very much.